There's a specific kind of accommodation that becomes invisible when you've been practicing it your whole life. You're the one who adjusts to other people's schedules, who gets rescheduled when something more important comes up, who waits for the callback, for the follow-through, for the moment someone has enough bandwidth to actually show up for you. And you accept this, most of the time, with a particular kind of quiet that comes from having accepted it for as long as you can remember. Not resentment, exactly. Something older than resentment. A low-grade, pre-verbal resignation that this is simply how it goes, that other people have competing demands, that there's always something more pressing, that your needs are the ones that get attended to eventually when there's room. And room, for some reason, is rarely made specifically for you. And here's what's curious about this. The person who lives inside this pattern is often not passive, not uninteresting, not someone who fails to inspire care. They're frequently warm, thoughtful, reliable, the kind of person who makes other people feel genuinely seen, who shows up, who holds space, who remembers what you mentioned 3 conversations ago. They know how to prioritize other people. Thoroughly, consistently, generously. They've just never quite known what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of it. And what's strangest from the inside is that this doesn't always feel like deprivation. It feels like normal. It feels like the particular shape of how relationships work for them, how they've always worked, and the feeling that something might be wrong with this arrangement arrives, when it arrives at all, only at the edges. In the specific quality of being moved to secondary. In the moment after someone cancels, again, when something brief and specific moves through them that they don't have a name for yet. Because the belief underneath this pattern, the one that makes it structural rather than situational, is not a thought. It's something quieter and more total. It's the expectation that they are simply not the kind of person who gets put first. John Bowlby's work on what he called internal working models describes the psychological structures formed in early childhood that become templates for understanding self and relationship. Not beliefs in the conscious sense, more fundamental than that. Operating assumptions, embedded in the relational nervous system about what can be expected from others and about what kind of self is present in the interaction. For the child whose needs were consistently secondary, not cruelly, often not even intentionally, but reliably, the working model that forms is specific. I matter, but not as much. My needs will be attended to eventually. But space is not made for me. I am not, in this relational architecture, the center. That model doesn't stay in childhood. It travels. You probably don't remember the exact moment you decided to stop asking for things. Because it wasn't a decision. It was an adjustment, and then another one, and another, until needing things quietly just became the way you moved through the world. I've spent a long time tracing this. Everything is linked in the description. And in the first pinned comment, Jeffrey Young at Columbia University, building on decades of cognitive research, developed what he called schema therapy, a framework centered on early maladaptive schemas, the deeply embedded belief structures formed in childhood that continue to shape adult perception and behavior. Among the schemas he identified are patterns centered on subjugation, the deeply internalized sense that one's own needs, desires, and priorities are less important than others, and on what he termed emotional deprivation, the expectation that one's needs for care and attention will not be met by others. These schemas don't announce themselves as beliefs. They present as reality. They feel like accurate descriptions of how the world is, not distortions of it. And they operate constantly, beneath awareness, shaping which relationships are entered, which treatment is accepted, which moments are interpreted as evidence, and which are dismissed as exceptions. The person who is never anyone's priority doesn't consciously choose to be in relationships where they remain secondary. They choose from the options that feel possible, the ones that confirm what they already understand to be true about their place in relational life. And the relationships that would contradict that understanding, the ones where they would be genuinely, consistently, unmistakably first, often feel, from the inside, wrong. Too much. Suspicious. Like waiting to find out what the catch is. And here's the cost that runs underneath all of this. It's not just that they accept less than they deserve. It's that they've stopped expecting more, and they can no longer always tell the difference between those two things. Because when you've spent long enough inside an expectation, it begins to feel like reality rather than expectation. The bar for what counts as being prioritized shifts. What would look, to an outside observer, like consistent deprioritization starts to look, from the inside, like normal variation. Like reasonable. Like probably their fault for needing too much. And there's something else, something that makes this pattern specifically self-perpetuating, that social psychology has documented with unusual precision. Research on self-fulfilling prophecies, a mechanism studied extensively since Robert Merton's foundational work and replicated in social psychological research for decades, shows that expectations don't just predict outcomes. They help produce them. The expectation shapes perception. We notice confirming evidence more readily than disconfirming evidence. It shapes interpretation. Ambiguous signals get read in the direction the expectation predicts. And it shapes behavior. We make choices that unconsciously move toward the familiar outcome. The person who expects not to be prioritized often, without realizing it, behaves in ways that produce exactly that. They ask for less, to avoid the disappointment of being declined. They downplay their needs before anyone has minimized them. They accept early signals of deprioritization without comment, allowing the pattern to establish itself before either person has named it. And the people around them, reading those signals, calibrate accordingly. They offer less. They reschedule more. They learn from the signals they're being sent that this person doesn't require much. And the expectation is confirmed. Not because it was accurate, because it was operational. But here's what almost nobody tells the person who is never anyone's priority. The expectation was accurate. Once. In the original environment, being secondary was the actual situation. The working model was built from real evidence, gathered in a real context, by a child who was observing correctly. The belief wasn't wrong then. It was an accurate reading of an environment that genuinely didn't have enough space. The problem is that the belief doesn't re-verify. It doesn't check the current context and ask, is this still true? It just runs. It runs in rooms that are nothing like the original, with people who have given no evidence they'll replicate the original experience, and it produces, through the subtle architecture of expectation and behavior, an outcome that looks remarkably like the original. The pattern finds its own conditions. And here's what makes that specific. The pattern doesn't announce itself as a pattern. It presents itself as evidence, as a series of real experiences, remembered accurately, that together form what feels like a reliable description of how the world treats this particular person. The canceled plans were real. The secondary position was real. The consistent experience of not being the priority was real. What the pattern can't see from the inside is how much of that experience was produced by the expectation rather than simply received by it. The behavior that was shaped by the belief, the asking for less, the accepting of more distance than warranted, the failure to notice or name early signals of deprioritization. All of that is invisible in the accounting. What's visible is only the outcome. And the outcome looks, every time, like confirmation. Which is why people in this pattern often feel not just lonely, but peculiarly fated. As though the experience of not being anyone's priority is something written into them, permanent, not a pattern to be understood and interrupted, but a fact to be accepted. The fact is real. The fate isn't. And the distinction between those two things is where everything changes. Not quickly, not comfortably, but specifically. One moment, one relationship, one occasion at a time. And the person, unable to see the mechanism because they're inside it, concludes, this is how it goes for me. This is how it has always gone. This is probably how it will always go. But that conclusion isn't about the world. It's about the expectation. And expectations, unlike environments, can be changed. And here's what that change looks like, not as a decision but as a practice. It begins, usually, in a moment so small it barely registers at the time. Someone offers something real, a prioritization that wasn't asked for, an arrangement made specifically around the person's needs, a gesture that says without ambiguity, you matter to me, and not just when it's convenient. And instead of receiving it, the person in this pattern does something almost reflexive. They minimize it. They explain it away. They produce a reason it doesn't count. It was easy for the other person. They were going to be in the area anyway. It doesn't mean what it might appear to mean. That minimization is the expectation defending itself. Jeffrey Young's schema therapy framework describes this as schema maintenance, the behavioral and interpretive patterns that prevent disconfirming evidence from actually registering as disconfirming. The person who expects not to be prioritized doesn't just receive less than they deserve, they actively discount the moments when they receive more. The schema makes the counter-evidence invisible, or reframes it as exception, or assigns it a motive that neutralizes its meaning. Which is why simply being around better people isn't enough. The pattern has to be interrupted at the interpretive level, at the moment when disconfirming evidence arrives and the schema moves to dismiss it. That interruption requires something the pattern specifically discourages, staying with the experience of being prioritized long enough to let it land. Long enough to feel uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and real. That pause between the evidence and the minimization is where everything begins to shift. If you watch this entire video, you're not the kind of person who just happens to be interested in this topic. You know this pattern from the inside. You've lived it. You're probably living it right now. I've spent a long time writing about exactly this. More than I could ever cover in a single video. It's all linked below, in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to ask you something directly. Think about the relationships in your life right now, the ones that feel the most important. Are there people in that group whose needs consistently come before yours? Not in a specific emergency, just as a baseline, the shape of how it goes. And when was the last time someone rearranged something for you? Not out of obligation, not because you were in crisis, but because being there for you was simply the priority. If the answer requires reaching back further than it should, notice that. Not as evidence that you don't deserve it, as evidence that somewhere in the operating system, there's an expectation that predicts this outcome. And expectations that predict outcomes tend to produce them. And then this. Think about the last time someone made you feel like a priority, genuinely, unmistakably, and what you felt in response. Was it warmth? Or was there something else? A faint discomfort? A suspicion? The quiet sense that this was too much or wouldn't last, or that you needed to do something to justify it. That response, the discomfort at being prioritized, is where the pattern is most visible. Because it shows that the expectation doesn't just shape what you receive. It shapes what you can tolerate receiving. You are allowed to be someone's priority. Not someday, not when you've earned it sufficiently, not when the circumstances are finally right. Now. As you currently are with the needs you currently have, without performing anything additional to justify the space. You were always allowed to be. The expectation just couldn't see it. And maybe the beginning of something different isn't finding different people, though that may come. Maybe it's noticing, the next time someone offers to prioritize you, whether you let them, whether you can stay in that, fully, without moving yourself to secondary before they have a chance to. That's not a small thing to practice. For someone who has been secondary for a long time, it might be the hardest thing. But it starts with believing, just once, that you're the kind of person it's possible for. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me what being someone's priority would feel like. I read everything. Subscribe if you haven't, because the final video in this series goes into the pattern that forms when someone learns, very early, that their needs are not something the people around them were built to carry. That one closes the whole arc. It's worth staying for.